What up, Cavs Nation? I'm your host, Ethan Sands, and I'm back with another episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. I'm joined by your favorite beat reporter, Chris Fedor. Chris, it feels like it's been a long time since we've done one of these, me and you. I want to get into how you feeling. We're heading into Game 5. How you doing? We're back in Boston. What's the vibe like?
I mean, the vibe is the Cavs are getting ready for a game where it obviously is going to decide their season fate. Odds are stacked against them. Not a lot of people believe they can come to Boston, get a win in Game 5. They're dealing with a bunch of different injuries. So, Cavs had a lot of work ahead of them to try and find a way to extend this series.
And it feels like, because we've talked about it, this Cavs team has been counted out on countless occasions this season. But, Chris, I want to get into the positives of this trip. The traveling,
Okay.
being able to come to Boston, a historic city. Chris, we got to go to Fenway Park. It was my first time going to Fenway Park. It was fantastic. The Boston Red Sox, not going to get into them as much as anything else.
Nobody cares about that.
They were able to pull out a victory, but the atmosphere, the stadium, what is it about Fenway Park that makes it so great to just be there?
It's just one of a kind, Ethan, because it's one of the last remaining stadiums of its kind. If you think about it, there's Wrigley Field, and then there's Fenway Park, and then everything else has been something different, or it has changed locations, or it has become bigger and more enhanced. And yeah, there are areas of Fenway where there's newer stuff, there's more modern stuff, but it's got the old feel to it. Every seat in Fenway Park is really, really good. It's so compact, it's so close. It's got the monster that makes it so unique. All of the stuff around Fenway, with the streets, with the bars, with the restaurants, some of those things have been there forever. And Joe Varden from The Athletic, who we went to the game with tonight, he was talking about it as we were walking to one of the gates, and he was like, hey, some of the greatest players of all time walked on these streets. Some of the greatest players of all time walked into this ballpark. And when you put it like that, it really makes you stop and appreciate everything about Fenway. Like, it's old. People people think that it needs to be even more updated. There are people that I have talked to that think it's kind of like dumpy in certain areas, but it's just got this charm to it that you can't help but feel a vibe of being at a baseball game and feeling something special when you're inside there.
Yeah, and like you said, Chris, it doesn't matter if you are a baseball fanatic, if you are a Red Sox fan, if you grew up in Boston, if you have the opportunity to go to Fenway Park, it is a historic stadium and something that everyone should be able to just be a part of, even if just for a ball game. It doesn't matter who they're playing or whatever. Tonight it was the Tampa Bay Devil Rays or Tampa Bay Rays, whatever the name is now. But it's just something that, being a first timer walking into the arena, I walk into this stadium. I was a little bit late tonight because my Uber and flight and all of that, that's the logistics that we don't have to get into. But knowing that, I walked in and there were still multiple people outside just enjoying the space of being at Fenway Park, even if they weren't inside Fenway Park, was such a different feel for me, especially because I've only been to 2 ball games this year. But that's not the ball game that we're talking about for today. It's Game 5. We're getting ready for the Boston Celtics, Cleveland Cavaliers, 3-1 series, Chris. 13 people have come back. 13 teams have come back for that. it's not looking good for the Cavs, but especially with what they got coming on the injury report, Donovan Mitchell is questionable. Karis LeVert is doubtful. Jared Allen is
Questionable.
questionable. It's
Karras is questionable.
okay. Karis is questionable. So it's so different thinking about where this Cavs team could have been coming into the series and now looking at what they've been dealt to deal with for the final couple games of this series as it comes down to the wire. What do you think about the chances for the Cleveland Cavaliers going into game 5 and what they need to do to bring it back to Cleveland for game 6?
Honestly, Ethan, I think the Cavs are in a situation right now in this series against the opponent that they're playing against, um, dealing with all the different injuries that they're dealing with. I think they're just in a situation where they're going to need help. They're going to need Boston to not have the focus that they did in Game 3 and Game 4. They're going to need Boston to have a really, really cold shooting night. They're going to need Boston to settle for ill-advised shots, difficult shots. They're going to need Boston to get caught up in a switch-heavy scheme, and maybe it takes away from their offensive flow and they start attacking in isolation situations and one-on-one situations. It's going to take that kind of stuff. That's how I feel about it anyway. And look, the Cavs, they're probably going to come out in game 5 and they're going to gun a bunch of threes. They're going to try and space the floor. That's what they did in game 4. And that can always be the great equalizer, especially when you have capable three-point shooters the way that the Cavs do. But there's just so much that is working against this team right now. And there are only so many moves that JB Bickerstaff can make as a playoff chess master. There's only so many guys that he can go to when it comes to his rotation. There are only so many lineup decisions that he can make, both with the starters and guys coming off the bench. At some point, you just look at the situation that the Cavs are in, Ethan, and you say, they just don't have enough. They can fight, they can execute, they can do smart things at both ends of the floor. They can battle, they can be resilient because that's what they've been all season long. But all of those things don't necessarily lead to a win. They showed all those things, and it didn't lead to a win back in Cleveland. So I just find it hard to believe that they're going to be able, under the circumstances, I find it hard to believe that they're going to be able to go into TD Garden for a game 5 when the Celtics have an opportunity to close it out and win, with Donovan Mitchell probably not going to play, Jared Allen probably not going to play. Who knows when it comes to Karras? We'll get a better indication of that at shoot around. At some point, you just don't have enough for the opponent that you're playing against. And we talked about this too, Ethan. The margin for error for the Cavs coming in this series was so small. They have to do so much right throughout the course of a game just to be consistently competitive with the Celtics. And now that margin for error has gotten smaller and smaller as this series has gone on because of the situation with Donovan and now the situation with Karras.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at the starting lineup. Like, without Donovan, Karis LeVert slid into the starting lineup. Now,
Mm,
potentially, Karis is not going to be able to go. Jared Allen, not in the starting lineup if he's not being able to go. Like, these are things that simply cannot be accounted for when you
right.
go into a series thinking that, sure, Jared Allen was questionable from the beginning of the series if he was going to be able to go. But you thought that Dean Wade would be able to come back. You thought Donovan Mitchell was going to be able to carry this team. And now it's really like, who else can step up? And you said it, Chris. Those threes are going to be huge for this Cavs team. Sam Merrill might get
Mm,
a whole lot of minutes, and the subtexters, like Jimmy would say, will be waving their towels and going crazy about that. But is that enough? Are his minutes enough? Are his contributions to the offensive end with his lackluster defense going to be enough? Like, that's the reality of the situation that the
Mm-hmm.
Cavs have been put in. And I talked to the subtexters today, and I did a little AMA. So, yes, if you want to be anybody that wants to get to know a little bit more about Chris and me, AMA stands for, you know, anything. By anything means necessary. You can text us about what you want to talk about. But knowing that, my goodness, you had this lineup that you felt after the Orlando series had the possibility of being able to have a better lineup and better matchups with the Boston Celtics, who are the best team in the Eastern Conference, supposedly? The best team in the Eastern Conference altogether? Like in the NBA? Like, it's really just noticing how much this team has dealt with. And like I said with the subtexters, they said that it was soft, that the Cavs were soft. And I gave a running list of players that were dealing with injuries and continuing to play. Before
Mm-hmm.
Donovan Mitchell dealt with this calf strain that is potentially going to keep him out of game 4 and game 5, he was dealing with a lingering knee injury that, I mean, if we're being honest, there should have been no way that he played through that.
Mm-hmm.
Dean Wade is coming back from an injury that he could potentially need surgery from in the offseason, and he's playing. Like Jared Allen, bruised ribs. That's what they're classifying it as. Could be worse than that. Who knows? But I mean, Darius Garland with his back, Karis LeVert with his knee. There's so many different teams and so many different players that are playing through stuff in the playoffs, and I think that goes unnoticed when we talk about how this team has been constructed, how this team is playing. Somebody hit me up on subtext saying that Jared Allen finished the last 2-3 years with a bad record. Jared Allen was the second best, if not the best player on the Cavs team in this playoffs before he got injured.
Mm-hmm.
So, Chris, with all the injuries going on, with everything that the Cavs have been dealing with in this playoffs, do you feel like it's fair to say that this is a measuring stick, not the series, but this team, of who they are as a team for this playoffs? Or do you think that the injuries have been too much?
I don't know what you mean by that.
Saying like, we talked about it with Karis LeVert. He said, obviously, he would say, we're not really thinking about all the injuries we're dealing with. Do you think that the Cavs are like, if we had so and so healthy, this would be a different series? If we had Donovan Mitchell fully healthy, this would be a different series. Do you think that the Cavs are looking at it like everything that they don't have at 100% is impacting them in this playoff run?
How could they not look at it that way, Ethan? How could they not? They're human. I think there's a level of understanding of everything that they're missing. And I do think it's unfortunate for the Cavs. And look, sometimes when it comes to playoff basketball, luck is part of it. It's also a war of attrition. Who's going to be the healthiest team? Um, so you have to be healthy at the right time. You have to be playing well at the right time. You have to have luck on your side at the right time. But I think the thing that they're going to look at, which is unfortunate for the Cavs, is they don't know how they stack up with Boston in a 7-game series, right? There's no way for them to have any kind of general idea of that coming out of this series because they didn't have Jared Allen for any of the games because Donovan Mitchell missed, what could have been a game that evened it up. Who knows? It's just Yeah, I think there's going to be a feeling of what could have been or what would it have looked like? How competitive could we have been against this particular team? Because you do want to measure yourself against the best. You do want to see how far away you are from Boston. And look, Boston's not full strength either. Kristaps Porzingis is out, and Porzingis makes him a complete and utter cheat code at both ends of the floor. Um, but even against a watered down version of Boston, I think the Cavs wanted to see how do they stack up? What kinds of things do they need moving forward? Um, how do they handle the pressure of a close game in crunch time situations? Like all those different things, they're almost robbed of that opportunity. And now it makes it a little bit more difficult, I think, for the front office when it comes to evaluating this team, going into the offseason, evaluating players, evaluating the coach. Because what did they really learn about the Cavs in this series against the Celtics? Like, this isn't the version of the Cavs that this front office needed to evaluate in a 7-game series against Boston. You know what I mean? Like, they got that opportunity to evaluate that team for at least half of the series against Orlando, but that's Orlando. That's not Boston. The Cavs eventually want to get to where Boston is at the top of the Eastern Conference. Donovan Mitchell wants the Cavs to become Boston. He wants an opportunity to get to the conference finals, to get to the finals. And again, the series needs to play itself out. But when there's an off-season evaluation, I don't know how you get an honest gauge or a fair representation of what this team could have done against the Celtics in a 7-game series. And then it becomes more difficult for the front office when it comes to, okay, Jared Allen, Evan Mobley, keep them together, split them up. Darius Garland, Donovan Mitchell, keep them together, split them up. Because you want data. You want evidence of why it works, why it doesn't work. And they just haven't gotten that opportunity in this series against the Celtics. There's no way that anybody in this organization can look at this series and say, we were equipped to give Boston our best shot.
Yeah, and I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, this is what we talked about all season long, Chris. We talked about getting to the playoffs, that the Cavs will be evaluated for their season based on the playoffs. And now here we are, and this Cavs team is one, not 100%, and two, not being able to put their best lineups on the floor to determine how they have fared throughout the season. We know how good this team can be, obviously, with Donovan Mitchell as a regular season team. That's
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote what he's been known for. And
Mm-hmm.
he himself has wanted to get rid of that notion that he is just an 82 game player. And
Yes.
for yeah, that's where I was going with it. That's exactly where I was going with this. He has. He has been so good throughout the playoffs. He has carried this team. And I mean, to be very, very fair, now it's like, all right, I can't play potentially in game 5. He couldn't play in game 4. What can y'all do without me? And who's going to show me how they can step up?
But
And
like, here's the
in
thing. So I know that there was that. I know Donovan heard it, and I know that criticism was out there when it came to Donovan. But if we're being honest, Ethan, coming into these playoffs, I had the least amount of questions about Donovan and his playoff readiness and his playoff capability. My questions were surrounding Darius. My questions were surrounding Evan Mobley, Jared Allen. I, I, I mean, there's enough evidence that says Donovan can perform in the playoffs. There's enough evidence that says Donovan is one of the 15 to 20 best players in the NBA. There's enough evidence that says he is, provided that he continues to be as focused, as driven, as determined, he's going to be in the MVP conversation as his career continues to progress. right? So yeah, he got outplayed last year by Brunson, and he was not good in that series against the Knicks. It was the primary reason why they lost that series to me, because it was supposed to be the advantage that they had going into that series, and it didn't play itself out that way. And yeah, he got outplayed by Brunson the year before that when he was in Dallas and Donovan was in Utah, and Donovan was turned into a defensive turnstile. But like, he's one of the top 10 scorers in playoff history. The the 30-point games speak for themselves. The 40-point games speak for themselves. The 50-point games speak for themselves. There are all these different stats that continue to come out about Donovan, and they're either he's the only one in NBA history to do this, or he's in an exclusive fraternity when it comes to doing something like this. And that's all related, Ethan, to him in the playoffs. So for me, I had the least amount of questions about Donovan because I've seen it before. Maybe I didn't see it last year. Maybe I didn't see it the year before, but I saw it enough. Like Darius, when have you seen it? On the playoff stage. Now, this was only his second go around in the playoffs. So, you don't want to take what happened last year against the Knicks and say, that's who you are as a playoff performer. You know what I mean? That would be unfair. You can't judge him that kind of way. Same thing when it comes to Evan Mobley. So, my questions were about those guys. And when we go into this offseason, the Cavs front office questions are going to be about those guys. Donovan Mitchell's questions, when that contract extension is placed in front of him, they're going to be about those guys.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, after game 4, I believe you got a glimpse of what Darius Garland is capable of. But again, that is again in a situation without Donovan Mitchell on the court. So it's difficult to gauge what he is capable of with Donovan because I don't think in a playoff setting he's really shown that he can be that Robin to Batman in a playoff setting. But I
Here's the
mean,
other thing, though, Ethan. He showed it the other night. He was great the other night, and he deserves all of the credit for the way that he played, the way that he attacked Al Horford, the way that he attacked Boston's switch heavy defense, the way that he competed on the defensive end of the floor himself, the way that he got more comfortable, more confident as the game progressed, and what he did in the fourth quarter. Really, really good. He was a big part of them being able to cut the lead, um, make it a 2 possession game in about the final 90 seconds, I want to say. Um, but guys have good playoff games, right? The great players in the NBA are the ones who do it consistently. I mean, if you just look around the NBA, and I know Darius had 30, and that was a big deal, but like Dante DiVincenzo scored 30 the other night for the Knicks. Trying to think who else like had a one-off ridiculous playoff game.
I'm gonna stop you there. I'm gonna stop you
No,
there. Are we really ready to have that conversation? Like, because I
look,
think that's
all
a valid. I think that's valid.
look, all I'm saying is, like, doing it once does not make a star. Doing it once does not make you Robin. Doing it once does not make you some great playoff performer. The greats, the all-star caliber players, the second bananas, the franchise players, the 30 to 35 million dollar a year players, they do it consistently.
Yeah, and I mean, like we've talked about all year, Chris. That's who Darius wants to be. He
That's right.
wants to be that guy. He even before Donovan got here, he wanted to be that guy. And the Cavs gave him the keys to be that guy. And they said, "Well, you can't do it by yourself. So we're going to go get you a star who we think can help you out." And I think it's unfair to say that Donovan has not helped Darius, right? Or Darius has not helped Donovan. Like, Donovan is a nurturing player. Donovan
Mhm.
is a player that wants to give all the leadership, all the advice, all the experience that he has garnered over his career to someone else to help him. It doesn't mean that he wants them to take his spot, but he wants them to be able to be like right there with him. And Darius Garland has had spurts this season where he's shown that, but
Mhm.
it's been hard for him when Donovan is on the court as well because he's still adjusting. He's still learning how to be that second guy. And sure, to fans that think that it has taken too long, you're right. It's taken too long for Darius to be able to become that secondary player for Donovan Mitchell because we've seen it. I talked about it today with one of our subtexters about when is Donovan and when is Darius going to be able to figure it out together? When is Darius going to be able to be that all-star level player on a consistent basis that he was before Donovan got here? And I said, look at his numbers. The only thing that this person had asked for from Darius was that he wanted Darius to average 5 more points. That's it. Darius was averaging the same amount of assists that he wanted. He was still averaging the same amount of minutes that he wanted. He was still averaging the same amount of 3-point percentage that he wanted. The only thing that was left on that radar for Darius from this one subsector was the points production. And that also comes down to the limited amount of shots. And I think we saw it in game 4. He was able to get more shots off. He was able to understand or take back the burden that Donovan Mitchell had been carrying the entire season, the entire playoffs, and say, well, Donovan's not here. Somebody's got to do it. So
Mhm.
he went out and got 30. Didn't have the greatest field goal percentage, but he still got it done. And I think that's where we look at, like Chris has said, the other players that need to step up. Max Strus talked about after game 4 how great Darius Garland was in game 4 and how he needs to do better and everybody else needs to do better for him. So, Chris, who are you looking for in game 5 to make a difference for this Cavs team outside of Darius Garland because we know his responsibilities for this team with Donovan Mitchell being out?
I think the obvious answer is Evan Mobley. There's an advantage that the Cavs have inside. There's an advantage that they have at the rim. Evan Mobley being the guy that he was in game 2, that had people thinking, whoa, what if Evan Mobley plays like that for the remainder of the series against Boston? Whoa, what if that's the Evan Mobley that the Cavs get moving forward as we start to project what's going to happen with this roster, what's going to happen in the future of this organization? What if it's that from Evan Mobley on a consistent basis? So I do think there's going to be an opportunity for him again to attack mismatches. I do think there's going to be an opportunity again for him to show the kind of defensive force that he can be when it comes to protecting the rim, maybe deterring Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown from driving all the way to the basket as the last line of defense. I do think there are going to be opportunities for him when it comes to playmaking and passing and initiating and creating offense because the Cavs are going to need maybe um, multiple guys that can do that in the place of Donovan Mitchell and Karis LeVert if Karis can't go, if Donovan can't go. Um, so I just think based on how this game sets up and what the Cavs could potentially be missing, I think it's really, really easy to point at Evan. But I certainly think there's an argument to be made for Dean Wade. I think there's an argument to be made for Max Strus. And Max goes without saying, this is a playoff tested guy. This was the primary target for the Cavs in the offseason. He was considered their summer prize. Came from Miami, understands how to win in the playoffs, understands how to beat Boston, understands what playoff physicality is all about, has made playoff threes throughout the course of his career. So this was a guy that the Cavs brought in to kind of take them to the next level offensively, introduce a different dynamic to the team offensively, play with an edge, and just like understand how to handle these kinds of games in this kind of environment. So I do think you can point to Max as well. Because if we're being honest, he has not been good enough in this series against the Celtics. He has not been good enough in these playoffs in general, and he was brought here to be an impactful playoff performer.
Chris, this is getting slightly off topic, but I promise I'll get back on topic. But
Okay.
I wrote a story about Tristan Thompson not losing to the Boston Celtics in his playoff career.
Yeah.
Do you understand how ready I was to fire off a story about Max Strus and him being able to step up as he did for the Miami Heat culture and bring that back to the Cleveland Cavaliers and say, hey, I'm the shooter that you knew I was. I'm the
Right.
shooter that is ready to step up on the playoff stage because he has talked about it all season. Regular season? Okay, fine.
Right.
Playoffs. That's when it counts. And in
Yep.
the playoffs, Max Strus has not been the guy that we knew him to be so far. But, I mean, you mentioned it, and you mentioned him. Dean Wade, the guy that is playing on a potentially knee surgery injury in the offseason. What are your thoughts about him joining the starting lineup for Game 5? If all of the guys on the injury report are unavailable, that's Donovan Mitchell, that's Karis LeVert, that's Jared Allen, do you think he slides into the starting lineup?
I sent it out to the subtexters earlier today, our Cavs insiders, that the Cavs are kicking around the possibility of moving Dean Wade in the starting lineup. They considered it for Game 4 as well. It was a little bit tougher in Game 4. It was a second game back, and there was a belief going into that game that he was going to be on a minute restriction of about 18 to 20. Now, JB pushed that. He pushed it in Game 1, too, because he just doesn't have much of a choice. They need the things that Dean brings to the table, and I think it speaks volumes about the roster construction currently, and I also think it speaks to just the state of the Cavs roster at this point and what's available to them. For Dean, Ethan, for him to come back after like more than 2 months off and be the most impactful wing that they have, like that's great for Dean, and he deserves a lot of credit. And it shows the kind of impact that he can have, and it shows the kind of impact that he's had throughout the entire season that sometimes has gone undernoticed. But like that shouldn't be the case. He hasn't played basketball in more than 2 months. He spent that 2 months rehabbing an achy knee issue that may, like you said, require surgery in the offseason. But Isaac Okoro just hasn't given them enough. Max Strus just hasn't given them enough. If you want to lump George Niang in that wing conversation, you probably have to stretch that a little bit. But to bring this point home, he hasn't given them enough. Same thing with Karis LeVert. Karis LeVert's been up and down in terms of his impact and in terms of his production. So for Dean basically to come off the couch and be the most impactful wing that they have, one shows that this front office has some work to do when it comes to that particular position this offseason. And it also shows that, yeah, I think it's something that JB should consider because he has earned it. He gives them more offensively than Isaac Okoro. He gives them more shooting, more spacing. And defensively, he has been as good as anybody on Jason Tatum in the first couple of games since Dean has come back. In fact, according to NBA.com matchup data, when guarded by Dean Wade, Jason Tatum has scored 2 points on 1 of 7 from the field. And it feels like those numbers are really, really slanted in favor of Dean, but it also feels like that's passing the eye test too. Dean was making him work. Dean was making him settle for some tough shots. Dean was bodying him in a different kind of way than some of the other Cavs defenders. So, because of the way that he's played, because JB is willing to push the minute restriction anyway, um, and because of the lack of impact from the other guys that have occupied that spot, I absolutely do think that it's something that the Cavs should consider. Because I think they've been a better basketball team with Dean on the floor in this series than anybody else that has occupied that spot.
And I'm not gonna lie, JB Bickerstaff has been really consistent when he gives out a minute restriction to somebody during a press conference. Chris gets different information, you know. That's why you subscribe to Wine and Go Talk podcast, and that's why you subscribe to Subtext, so you get Chris's insight. Some things that I don't even get because, you know, big dog on campus. You know how that goes. But Dean Wade was given. I asked the question in the press conference to J.U. Bickerstaff before Game 4 about Dean Wade's minute restriction, and JB pondered for a good 10 to 15 seconds and was like,
No,
hmm.
no, it was like 5 seconds, if that. Come on now.
Okay,
Do you know how long 10
five
to
seconds.
15 seconds is?
It's too long, I guess. Too long.
Yes,
Anyway,
way too long. It
too
was like
long.
5
But
seconds.
he made like a groaning noise, and
Yeah,
then he goes, "I'm not gonna tell you that."
yeah.
I was like, "Okay, that's all I can ask for," because I think that is one of the only times that I've been a part of a press conference where JB has not given an exact minute restriction for a player. And that might be because he was willing to break it and he had done it the last couple times with Dean Wade. But I agree. I mean, Dean Wade, you talk about this is not anything to do with basketball, but country boy strength, blue collar strength. Like, he is one of those guys that says, I don't care what it takes. I'm going to be on the court. I'm going to be pushing people around. I'm going to be doing my thing. And we saw it with Jason Tatum. We saw it. We consistently see it with him playing on an injury that could possibly require surgery in the off season. Like, who does that? Like,
Right.
I don't know. You probably have better recollection of this than I do. But do you remember a player, potentially Donovan Mitchell, but we're not going to talk about that yet. But a player that is playing on an injury that they know could potentially give them or potentially call for surgery in the off season because he wants to be back. Have you seen that in recent years? Because I surely haven't.
I think it just depends. I mean, KD came back from a calf strain, knowing the risks, knowing what it could lead to, and then ruptured his Achilles because he tried to play through it. Jamal Murray is playing on an achy calf right now for the Denver Nuggets, and he's been incredibly impactful. But every single time he takes the floor, because it's a calf injury, it can lead to an Achilles tear. So yeah, I mean, you have seen certain guys like that have shined, that have battled through, and then all of a sudden the summer hits, and then you get the notification from Woj or Shams, and it says undergoing cleanup surgery or whatever the case may be. But it doesn't take anything away from Dean that I can come up with random examples of other guys who have done it too, because I know how hard he worked in terms of his rehab to get back to this point. And I know that there was pessimism from other people inside the organization about him returning at some point in the playoffs. So the fact that one, he is actually back, he's actually back in time to try and help this team for a couple of games against the Celtics, however long this series lasts. Um, that's first and foremost. That itself is an accomplishment. But the fact that he is back and healthy and holding his own in a playoff series, the Eastern Conference semifinals, with that competition, that level of intensity, that level of physicality, and playing against Jason Tatum and doing as good of a job as you can do against that caliber player, man, he deserves all the credit in the world. I've been saying this from the very beginning of the season, Ethan. Dean Wade should be a part of this every night rotation. Every successful team that has championship aspirations needs a guy like him, and the Cavs are a better team consistently when he is on the floor, and you feel his absence when he's off the floor. And I know that it doesn't always make all the sense in the world because he doesn't take a bunch of shots, he doesn't score a bunch of points, he doesn't get a bunch of assists, he doesn't get a bunch of rebounds, but he just does stuff that impacts winning at a high level. And you cannot discount that.
Yeah, Chris. I mean, I wrote my halftime observations after game 4, and I was looking at the stat lines trying to come up with what I was going to write about
Yeah.
also while watching the game. And I look across the stat sheet, and Dean Wade has the second highest plus minus on the team, and his sole contribution on that stat sheet was 1 block. Everything else was 0. No shots, no assists, no rebounds, no nothing. And I was like, this has to tell people how good he is with
Right.
his role. And
Right.
I'm going to give you your credit. You called it from the beginning of the season. Like, I think it was like our 3rd podcast when I was like, should George Niang be getting more minutes than than Dean Wade? And surely that has changed. Obviously, playoffs and regular season
I
are
have a
2 completely
I have a
different
question
things.
about this
But
roster moving forward though, Ethan. Like everybody that's on this roster played a part in the Cavs getting the 4 seed in the Eastern Conference and having, based on everything that they were forced to overcome, having a successful regular season. Because I don't think there are a lot of people that, given everything that they missed throughout the course of the year, I mean, of all the playoff teams, they are the one that had the most absences because of injury, because of suspension, and because of illness. I mean, that speaks volumes to everything that they overcame in the regular season. So I think there were a lot of people that said, nah, they're not going to win 48 games. No, they're not going to be one of the top 4 seeds in the East. So to me, it was a successful regular season. And to me, in the regular season, they actually overachieved. But I just wonder, and this is my question, do they have too many regular season players and not enough playoff players? Because there's a difference between an 82 game player and a 16 game player. And if you want evidence of it, just look at George Niang. He was the second most important player off the bench all season long. He helped stabilize the bench. He was a consistent fixture of the every night rotation. He brought floor spacing and shooting and scoring punch and all those different things to take the Cavs from the 3rd worst bench in the NBA last year to middle of the pack, which was a significant leap, and it was a respectable ranking for them. But once we got to the playoffs, you could see the flaws, you could see the limitations. So I just wonder if the way that this roster is built, if there are too many 82 game players and not enough 16 game players.
And I think that's so funny, Chris. I think that's a great point, first of all. Let me say that first. But I think it's hilarious because knowing how this roster was constructed after last season's New York Knicks loss, they
Mm-hmm.
said, we're going to go get Tristan Thompson. We're going to go get
Mm-hmm.
Marcus Morris Sr. We're going to go get George Niang. We're going to go get Max Strus because those guys are battle tested. Those guys
Mm-hmm.
are playoff series bound. But it doesn't always show up in the playoffs. It doesn't always contribute to the playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
It is about what you get when you get there. And we've talked about it all season, Chris. The regular season is completely separate from the playoffs. There's
Mm-hmm.
different guys, there's different teams, there's different players, there's different schemes. Like, we've seen it in the playoffs. Different rosters and different rotations can get cut down from 15 guys, 12 guys to
Mm-hmm.
8 guys, depending on who the team is.
Right.
And I think looking at what all Cavs Nation is saying, and that we need to trade everybody because they weren't playoff bound. How do you know that they're not going to have the same regular season that you enjoyed and then not show up in the playoffs if you
Yeah.
don't continue to build? And that's me saying, I think I like the pieces of this team. I
Mm-hmm.
like how this team has been built, the camaraderie of this team, the joy of this team. I don't know if there has been a team locker room that I've been a part of when things are going well, when things are even going bad, that they have each other's back, that they are enjoying each other's presence and being able to just be human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. Maybe this is a summer where it's total reconstruction and the Cavs say let's blow it up and we'll figure out depending on who we want to build around. But
Mm-hmm.
knowing what this Cavs team has been through this season, all the
Yeah.
injuries, all the doubt, all of the left for dead, and still been able to have the season that it did, along with the playoffs that they did have and are still having, because the season's not over, series not
Mm-hmm.
over. Game
Mm-hmm.
5 is tomorrow, and as we know, this Cavs team is known for pulling off some historic feats, especially when LeBron James is potentially yes or no in the building. But
I want to go
um,
back to what you said too, because I think this is an interesting point. There may be some people out there that look at the George Niang signing this offseason and say, it didn't work out. They should have spent their money elsewhere. And the argument for that is that he can't play in the playoffs. He was awful against Orlando in that series, and he has collected, well, he would be collecting DNPs in most situations, but the Cavs are obviously missing some bodies, so it allows him to get a couple of brief stints here or there. So he has become a guy who is basically an afterthought of this rotation. So that would be the argument that backs up the claim that the George Niang signing didn't work out because he isn't giving the Cavs in the playoffs what they thought they were getting when they signed him. But you can't always look at it only through that lens, because are the Cavs in the same situation if they wouldn't have signed George? Do they win 48 games? Are they the 4 seed? Do they match up with Orlando in the first round of the playoffs? Or do they match up with Milwaukee instead? Or New York instead? You know what I mean? Because everybody on this roster had a role in the Cavs getting to this point at some point. And for some guys, it's bigger role in the playoffs. For other guys, bigger role in the regular season. But everybody had a role in the Cavs getting to this point, winning 48 games, getting the 4 seed, playing against the Magic in the first round, all of that kind of stuff. So it's hard for me to look at, even though I understand the flaws and the limitations of George in a playoff series. And the same thing when it comes to Sam Merrill. It's hard for me, and the same thing when it comes to Max Strus so far in these playoffs. It's hard for me to look at the offseason moves and say that they were wrong or that the Cavs should have gone a different direction, because we can't just assume that they would be here in this same spot competing with Boston in the Eastern Conference semifinals as one of 8 teams. There are only 8 teams left, Ethan, right now at this point, and they're one of them. Okay, so I don't think we can just sit here and assume that they would be in the same position if they didn't sign Niang, if they didn't acquire Max Strus in a sign and trade because every move led them to this place.
Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying. George Niang played in 82 games of the regular season.
Right.
The entire regular season. He's an Iron Man. Like, sure, he hasn't played good at all to any extent in the playoffs. But it's really about what you consider success for this team, for this roster, and how it was constructed. And that goes down to J.U. Biggerstaff and his adjustments throughout the season.
Mm-hmm.
That goes down to Kobe Altman and the players that he went and got in the offseason, and even getting Marcus Morris Sr. during the buyout market. But I think we have to end this podcast on a positive note because of how just impactful this season was for the Cavs. Like, in all shapes and minds, this is the first time they've reached the second round since 2018.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is a team without LeBron James that has reached the second round for the first time since 1993. It is numbers on numbers and stats on stats that you can look at and think about that continue to pile up about what this team was able to succeed and do and contribute to the franchise history. And sometimes that's all you can ask for. But here's what I'm going to add, because I don't think we've talked about this yet. Craig Porter Jr. is doubtful for Game 5 and showed up in his first time in shoot-around the other day in Cleveland. And that's the first time I've seen him dribble a ball, shoot a basketball after his season finale injury against the Charlotte Hornets. And we talked about the injuries that have happened in this season and how impactful they have been. It would be really, really nice for the Cavs to have a backup point guard right now with Donovan being out. But it's very unlikely that Craig Porter Jr. returns for this series. And even if he does return, how much he can contribute. But, Chris, we're going to end this podcast shortly. You have anything you would like to add?
Nope. I don't think so. Not at this point. Nothing that stands out to me, anyway.
All right. Game 5, tomorrow. Potentially the last game of the Cavs season. Or we could see you back in Cleveland for Game 6. But before all of that comes to fruition, we got to get through Game 5. So, to do so, that will end this episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. But remember to subscribe to Subtext. As we've talked about all podcast long, you get to interact with me and Chris. You can hit us with any questions you have on our traveling days, or you can get insight on injury updates and things of that nature. But to do so, you got to sign up for a 14-day free trial or visit cleveland.com/Cavs and click on the blue bar at the top of the page. If you don't like it, that's fine. All you have to do is text the word STOP. It's easy. But we can tell you that the people who sign up stick around, because this is the best way to get insider coverage on the Cavs from me, Chris, and maybe even Jimmy Watkins. We'll have to see. But for all the fun that we're having, that will wrap up today's episode. Y'all be safe. We'll see you after Game 5.